So in light of me getting 100 subscribers today, and in light of Sunkist's plans to guts certain programs, I'm going to give you guys a lesson on how our currency really works. So we've been taught ad infinitum that this is how everything works, where you have the taxpayer giving money to the government, then pays for the programs, pays for the goods and services, and the rich people, and back to us taxpayers. But you see this little thing over here called gold value? I'm going to let you in a little secret. The gold standard is dead. The gold standard has been deceased ever since 1971, when someone unalived the Bretton Woods Agreement, and the Bretton Woods Agreement was unalived by someone named Richard Nixon. Getting us off of the gold standard is the only thing that Richard Nixon actually did that was actually beneficial to us working class people. And you can quote me on this one: backing your currency on a finite resource is as stupid as selling water from a dried up well. And now for a little demonstration of how our currency actually works and has worked for over 54 years. This chart runs a little different. There's a reason why I'm having the word taxpayer in quotation marks. I'll get to that in a second. Here in reality, our currency system runs on something called MMT, or modern monetary theory, or as I prefer to call it, the tax standard. What we're actually giving to the IRS when we send our federal income taxes to Washington, D.C. is actually funding our currency's value. And it's from that value that our government gets money from in order to spend on whatever they like, on policy and programs, or just giving away as tax breaks to capitalists like Twitbird. Now, I know what you're thinking.
But if the government doesn't need our money to pay for anything, what's to stop them from spending too much money?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Mr. Wallet, and there is one actual constraint that keeps our government from spending more than what it can afford. And that real constraint is something called real resources. Those real resources can come in the form of workers or personnel and raw materials, among other things. That means without us workers, the currency system we have doesn't exist. So now we have to understand the concept between currency users and currency issuers. Currency users are basically all of us poor working class people, or the taxpayer, and the middle class or the petit bourgeois, along with businesses, and here's the crucial part: local, state, county governments are all currency users just like us. So this whole dynamic of governments needing our money to pay for anything, it does exist for local and state governments. The only exception is the federal government. In other words, our nincompoops in Washington, D.C. are not constrained by money. They're just constrained by real resources. In other words, our government can easily afford Medicare for all, but they're just choosing not to. Not to mention, our government has been lying to us about what the national debt really means. When our government talks about national debt, they're not talking about something we owe anyone else. What that debt really is money in our pockets. As the intrepid economist Stephanie Kelton said, their red ink is our black ink. Translation: when you hear politicians complain about the national debt, what they're really saying is the working class has too much money to spend. And just in case that new government agency isn't enough of a red flag, this is what it means in a nutshell. Pause to read. The highbrow term for stealing money from the poor and working class is something called austerity. So from here on out, if I ever have to refer to this agency that Twitbird created, it's no longer this. It's going to be called the Austerity Department. And as my comrade Steve Grumbine says, austerity is the process of unaliving someone. To drive the point home further, I'm going to read a passage out of Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory, and the Birth of the People's Economy. Whenever the topic of Social Security comes up, or when someone in Congress wants to put more money into education or healthcare, there was a lot of talk about how everything must be paid for to avoid adding to the federal deficit. But have you noticed this never seems to be a problem when it comes to expanding the defense budget, or bailing out the banks, or giving huge tax breaks to the wealthiest Americans? Even when those measures significantly raise the deficit, as long as the votes are there, the federal government can always fund its priorities. That's how it works. Deficits didn't stop FDR from implementing the New Deal in the 1930s. They didn't dissuade JFK from letting a man on the moon. And they never once stopped Congress from going to war. That's because Congress has the power of the purse. If it really wants to accomplish something, the money can always be made available. If lawmakers wanted to, they could advance legislation today that aimed at raising living standards or delivering the public investments in education, technology, and resilient infrastructure that are critical for our long-term prosperity. Spending or not spending is a political decision. If you want to know more, follow along.